Frostbite doesn't take a quick up on ridge. It works slow. Turns fingers to wood, breath to glass, until you finally decide to just close your eyes. Hiram found the bundled rags beneath a dead pine. Inside lay a blue-lipped woman. Beside her, something small and terribly quiet. Abandoned with a baby in the snow, she met a lonely mountain man who changed their destiny forever. The particular cold of a high-country morning didn't just chill the skin. It hollowed out the bones. Hiram stood at the edge of the tree line, his breath pluming in thick, ragged clouds that froze into frost on his beard. He didn't shiver. Shivering meant the body was fighting. Hiram had long ago learned to just let the cold sit over him, a heavy woolen blanket of misery that he accepted as the toll for living at 9,000 feet. He leaned into the hill, the weight of a rifle stock against his shoulder grounding him. Below, the valley was a jagged maw of white and gray. The only sound was the hollow, rhythmic thumping of a creek running under ice, fighting a losing battle against the freeze. Hiram tracked the snowpack. He was looking for Martin, maybe a stray fox foolish enough to venture out in the squall. Instead, he found parallel gouges in the drift, wagon ruts. They were shallow, already filling with the powdery drift of the morning wind, but they told a clear story. Someone had brought a team up the pass, hit the deep drifts of the incline, panicked, and turned back. He followed the ruts not out of curiosity, but out of caution. Trouble down in the valley had a habit of wandering up the mountain, 50 yards off the rudimentary trail, half buried under a windfall of dead pine branches. He saw the disruption in the snow. He approached slow. He didn't call out. Out here, you didn't announce yourself to unknowns. He nudged the snowbank with the toe of his boot. Canvas yielded. Underneath the canvas, wool. Hiram knelt, laying the rifle across his thighs. He pulled back the stiff, icy canvas tarp. She was curled into a tight, rigid ball. Her skin was the color of skim milk, her lips carrying a deep, bruising blue. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes. She wore a coat meant for a parlor in Denver, not a blizzard in the Rockies. Hiram pressed 2 calloused fingers against the hollow of her neck. He waited. The wind howled through the pines, a long, atonal whistle. There, a thready, weak pulse, barely a flutter like a moth trapped in a jar. He shifted to stand to leave her. He wasn't a savior. He was a man who barely had enough salted meat and split wood to keep his own heart beating until the spring thaw. Dragging a dying woman back to his cabin was bad math. It was a caloric deficit he couldn't afford. Then the bundle against her chest shifted. It wasn't a twitch of the wind, it was a deliberate, jerking motion. A muffled, reedy squeak leaked from the layers of heavy wool wrapped tight against her sternum. Hiram froze. He stared at the bundle. He looked down the mountain where the wagon tracks disappeared into the whiteout. Then he looked back at the woman. "Damn it," he muttered, the words instantly swallowed by the wind. He didn't think about it anymore. Thinking was dangerous. He worked with mechanical efficiency. He slung his rifle over his back and hoisted the woman by her shoulders. She was dead weight, heavy with ice and impending death. He adjusted his grip, getting his arms under her knees and her back, and lifted. The hike back to the cabin was a brutal exercise in endurance, 3 miles of uphill terrain in knee-deep snow. His muscles burned, screaming for oxygen. The wind whipped ice particles against his face, stinging like birdshot. He didn't look at her face. He just watched the snow in front of his boots, focusing on placing one foot in front of the other. Step, breathe, step, breathe. His cabin appeared through the squall like a dark bruise against the snow. It was a low, squat structure of peeled logs and chinking, half buried in a drift. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from the stone chimney. Hiram kicked the heavy door open and stumbled inside. The sudden drop in wind resistance nearly pitching him forward. He kicked the door shut behind him with a backward swing of his heel. The latch fell with a heavy, metallic clack. The cabin was dim, smelling of rendered animal fat, old wood smoke, and damp wool. He laid the woman on the rope-strung bed in the corner. His shoulders ached, his hands were numb claws. He didn't rest. He moved to the iron stove, shoving a handful of kindling and 3 thick splits of seasoned oak into the belly of it, cranking the damper wide open. The metal began to tick and ping as the heat built. Only then did he turn back to the bed. He reached for the bundle strapped to the woman's chest. Her arms, stiff as iron rods, were locked around it. Hiram had to pry her fingers back, one by one. The joints popped, a sound that made his jaw tighten. He pulled the bundle free and set it on the rough-hewn table. He peeled back the top layer of wool, then a layer of flannel. A face, red and squalling, stared up at him. The baby was small, maybe 3 months old. Its tiny fists punched at the cold air, and it let out a wail that shattered the years of silence built into the cabin walls. Hiram stared at the infant. The baby stared back, eyes dark and wet. The mountain man let out a long, slow breath. He walked over to his supplies, pulled down a tin cup, and reached for a tin of evaporated milk he'd been saving for an emergency. The emergency had arrived. Water boiled on the flat top of the cast-iron stove, rattling the lid. Hiram stood beside the table, dipping a clean strip of cotton rag into a mixture of warm water and canned milk. He squeezed the excess liquid out and held the damp cloth to the infant's mouth. The baby, swaddled tightly in one of Hiram's spare flannel shirts, rooted blindly for a moment before latching onto the rag. It sucked greedily, swallowing the milky water. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the popping of the wood stove and the wet, rhythmic sounds of the child feeding. Hiram watched the baby with guarded eyes. He was a man shaped by isolation, accustomed to the predictable company of timber and stone. This fragile, noisy thing was an alien presence. Yet his large, scarred hands moved with surprising care, re-dipping the rag when it ran dry, adjusting the baby's head so it wouldn't choke. Across the room, the woman remained motionless on the bed. Hiram had removed her frozen outer coat and the stiff, wet boots. He hadn't bothered with modesty. Survival didn't leave room for it. He wrapped her feet in heated blankets and placed warm stones wrapped in burlap near her core. Now, it was just a waiting game. The human body either found its way back from the edge, or it slipped over. He couldn't force it either way. Hours bled into evening. The light outside the single, grease paper window shifted from blinding white to a bruised, violet twilight. The wind picked up, battering the logs, shaking the heavy timber frame. Hiram sat in a hand-carved chair near the stove, a piece of saddle leather in his lap, working an awl through the tough hide. The baby slept in a makeshift cradle, a wooden crate padded with furs placed safely on the floor near the hearth. A sharp intake of breath broke the rhythm of Hiram's awl. He paused, not looking up immediately. He listened. On the bed, the blankets rustled. A low, dry cough. Hiram set the leather aside. He picked up a tin mug from the stove's warming shelf. It held a thin broth made from dried venison and root ends. He walked toward the bed, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The woman's eyes were open. They were wide, frantic, darting around the dim cabin. The moment she saw Hiram, a massive figure silhouetted by the firelight, beard tangled, shoulders broad enough to block out the room, panic seized her features. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the log wall. Her hand groped blindly on the side table, closing around the heavy iron handle of a fire poker. She raised it, her arm trembling so violently the metal rattled. "Where is he?" Her voice was a cracked rasp, stripped of moisture. Hiram didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands in surrender, nor did he step back. He simply stood there, holding the steaming mug. "Put the iron down," he said. His voice was like gravel crushed under a wagon wheel, low, rough, and entirely devoid of threat. "My baby," she choked out, her knuckles white around the poker. "What did you do with him?" Hiram jutted his chin toward the floor near the stove. "He's asleep, fed him warm milk. He's got better sense than you right now. He knows when he's warm." The woman's eyes darted to the wooden crate. She saw the bundle of blankets. A ragged sob tore from her throat. The iron poker slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly against the dirt floor. She tried to throw the covers off, to lunge toward the crate, but her legs refused to bear weight. She collapsed halfway off the mattress, gasping in pain as the blood rushed back into her frost-damaged extremities. Hiram caught her by the shoulder before she hit the floor. His grip was firm, impersonal. He hauled her back onto the mattress. "Don't move," he said. "Your feet are half dead. You try walking. You'll tear the skin right off your soles." She looked up at him, defiance warring with absolute exhaustion. "Who are you?" "Name's Hiram. You're in my cabin. Found you up on the ridge." He held out the tin mug. "Drink this. It ain't pretty, but it'll keep you upright." She stared at the mug, then at him. Distrust radiated from her, a palpable energy in the small room. She didn't know this man. She knew only the cruelty of the men who had left her in the snow. Hiram didn't press. He set the mug on the wooden stool beside the bed. "Drink it or don't," he said, turning his back on her. "I ain't your nursemaid." He walked back to his chair, picked up his awl and leather, and resumed his work. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask who had driven the wagon up the pass, or why they had shoved a woman and a child into a snowbank to die. The mountain didn't care about the past. It only cared about who had the strength to see tomorrow. 10 minutes passed in silence. Then Hiram heard the faint scrape of tin against wood. He didn't look up, but he listened to the slow, steady swallows as the woman drank the broth. The storm did not break. It settled over the peaks, an immovable gray ceiling that dumped foot after foot of powder into the valley. The cabin became an island. Her name was Josie. She offered it on the 3rd day, after her legs could bear her weight without buckling, and after realized Hiram had no intention of interrogating her. "Josie," she had said, standing by the stove with the baby resting on her hip. "His name is Ben." Hiram had been greasing his boots. He nodded once. Hiram. That was the extent of their introductions. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in proximity and avoidance. The cabin was a single room measuring 20 by 15. Every breath, every shift of weight, every sigh was shared. Yet they constructed invisible walls. Hiram kept to his routines. He chopped wood in the attached lean-to, cleaned his rifle, mended his gear, and ventured out on snowshoes to check his short traps when the wind died down enough to allow it. Josie took over the interior. It wasn't an agreement they struck. It was the natural economy of survival. She couldn't track a deer in 4 feet of snow. but she could keep the fire banked. She mended a tear in Hiram's canvas coat with stitches tighter and cleaner than he had managed in a decade. She boiled down the tough venison into a stew that actually had flavor, utilizing dried herbs she found in jars he had long forgotten. Hiram watched her, not with the leering gaze of a lonely man, but with the assessing eye of a survivalist. She was tough. The frostbite had taken a toll. The tips of her left fingers remained numb and white for weeks, and she walked with a slight limp. But she didn't complain. She didn't weep for whatever life she had lost down in the settlements. She focused entirely on the boy, Ben, and on making herself useful. The silence between them, initially thick with distrust, began to thin. It transformed into a functional quiet. A truce. One evening, a month into the deep freeze, the dynamic shifted. The wind had died, leaving the mountain in an eerie, crystalline stillness. The moon cast blue shadows across the snow. Inside, the stove radiated a steady, baking heat. Josie was sitting on the edge of the bed, nursing Ben under a heavy blanket. Hiram was at the table, running a whetstone over his hunting knife. The metallic shh was a rhythmic anchor in the quiet room. Suddenly, a low, guttural vibration rattled the floorboards. Hiram stopped mid-stroke. The knife hovered above the stone. Outside, from the lean-to where Hiram kept his draft mule, a sudden violent kicking erupted. Wood splintered. The mule let out a high, terrified bray. Josie stiffened, pulling the baby closer to her chest. "What is it?" she whispered. Hiram was already moving. He slid the knife into his belt and reached for the repeating rifle mounted above the door. Wolves, probably driven down by the snow, smelled the mule. He checked the chamber, his face a mask of hard angles in the dim light. "Stay away from the door," he ordered. He didn't wait for her nod. He unlatched the heavy timber door and pushed it open. The cold rushed in like a physical blow. Josie watched him disappear into the dark. Her pulse jumped at her throat. She looked at the infant in her arms, then at the empty cabin. If Hiram died out there, she and the boy were dead too. They wouldn't last a week without him. She laid the baby gently in the wooden crate. She didn't hesitate. She crossed the room, her bare feet silent on the dirt floor, and took down the double-barreled shotgun Hiram kept hanging near the hearth. It was heavy, the stock cold against her hands. She checked the breech. Loaded, 2 heavy brass shells. She moved to the doorway, keeping her back to the wall, peering out into the moonlit yard. The lean-to was 20 yards away. Hiram was a dark shape moving against the snow. 3 smaller, fluid shadows circled the structure. They were massive, their coats thick and silver in the moonlight. Timber wolves, starving and desperate. One wolf lunged toward the lean-to entrance. Hiram brought the rifle up and fired. The crack of the shot rolled across the valley like thunder. The wolf yelped, spinning away into the powder. But the other 2 recognized the real threat. They turned on Hiram. They moved with terrifying speed, flanking him. Hiram worked the lever of the rifle, bringing it to his shoulder, but the mechanism jammed, the cold metal seizing up. He cursed, dropping the rifle to his side and pulling his hunting knife in one fluid motion. A wolf sprang. Josie stepped into the doorway. She didn't aim. The weapon was too heavy to hold steady for long. She just pointed the barrel toward the snowbank between Hiram and the flanking wolf, braced the stock against her shoulder, and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed her backward, her shoulder exploding in pain. The shotgun roared, spitting a cone of fire and buckshot into the night. The snow 10 feet from the wolf erupted. The animal, deafened and showered with ice, broke its charge. It skidded in the snow, looked at the cabin, and then bolted for the tree line. The third wolf, seeing its pack break, turned and vanished into the shadows. Silence crashed back down on the clearing, ringing in Josie's ears. Hiram stood in the snow, his knife still drawn, breathing hard. He looked at the spot where the wolf had been, then turned slowly toward the cabin. Josie was leaning against the doorframe, the shotgun hanging loosely in one hand, her breathing shallow and fast. Hiram walked back slowly. He picked up his jammed rifle, knocked the snow from the barrel, and stopped at the threshold. He looked at the shotgun in her hand, then up at her face. His guarded eyes held a new unreadable weight. "Kicks hard," was all he said. "I noticed," Josie replied, her voice trembling just slightly. He reached out and took the shotgun from her. Their hands brushed. His fingers were freezing. Hers were warm from the cabin heat. It was the first time they had touched since the day he dragged her from the snow. Hiram stepped inside and shut the door, throwing the heavy iron latch. He set the guns against the wall and walked over to the stove to warm his hands. Josie moved back to the crate, checking on Ben, who was stirring but unharmed by the noise. The cabin settled back into quiet, but the air had changed. The invisible walls they had built over the last month were fractured. She wasn't just a burden he had pulled from the snow anymore, and he wasn't just the gruff stranger keeping her alive. They had defended the same ground. Hiram looked over his shoulder. Josie was watching him, the firelight catching the sharp, resilient lines of her face. He didn't smile, but the hard set of his jaw softened just a fraction. He turned back to the fire. The winter was long, but they were no longer weathering it alone. Winter on the mountain doesn't forgive, and this story is far from over. If you found something worth holding on to here, consider subscribing and leaving a like. Share this with someone who knows the value of a slow fire on a cold night. We'll be right here next time, keeping the wood stove burning, ready to tell you what happens when the snow finally clears. Join our community, gather round the hearth, and let's finish this journey together. See you soon. Part 4, The Thaw and the Threat Spring in the High Country, was an ugly, violent rebirth. It didn't arrive with a gentle warming of the breeze. It tore through the valley with the deafening roar of ice-choked creeks breaking their banks. The snowpack, which had blanketed the world in pristine white, receded like a dying, shedding beast, leaving behind sodden black earth and the skeletal remains of winter windfall. Inside the cabin, the oppressive smell of confinement, damp wool, wood ash, and rendered fat, began to lift, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of wet pine needles and thawing mud. Josie stood on the small porch, Ben propped securely on her hip. The baby was heavier now, his cheeks round and flushed, his dark eyes sharp as they tracked the erratic movement of a Steller's jay in the canopy. Hiram was in the yard, working through the last of the winter cordwood. The rhythmic thwack of the axe was a metronome to the morning. His heavy flannel shirt was discarded on a stump, and the pale, deeply scarred skin of his shoulders was slick with sweat in the thin, pale April sun. Josie watched the fluid play of muscle beneath his skin. Over the grueling months of winter, she had memorized the cadence of his movements. He never wasted energy. Every step, every swing of the axe was calculated for maximum efficiency. She didn't look away when he buried the axe head into the chopping block, with a final, echoing blow, and turned to wipe his brow with the back of his hand. He caught her, staring. He didn't smile. He rarely did. But he walked over, his heavy boots sucking and popping in the thick mud. He reached out a large, calloused finger. Ben reached for it instantly, gripping the thick digit with surprising infant strength. "He's got a grip like a farrier," Hiram observed. His voice was quieter than it had been in those bleak December days. The gravel was still there, but the sharp, defensive edges had worn down into something resembling comfort. "He's a mountain boy now," Josie said. Hiram looked from the boy to her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of things neither knew how to articulate. The brutal winter had stripped them down to their elemental cores, removing the polite fictions of society. But now, with the valley past slowly revealing its switchbacks, the reality of the world below loomed like a dark storm front. "Pass is clearing fast," Hiram said, gently withdrawing his hand from the baby's grasp. He looked down the mountain, his eyes narrowing at the valley floor. A heavy wagon could make it up halfway by next week. A determined man on horseback could make it today. Josie instinctively tightened her hold on Ben. The warmth of the spring sun suddenly felt thin and inadequate. "You want us gone." "Didn't say that. You didn't have to." Hiram walked over to the log, picked up his shirt, and pulled it over his head, hiding the scars. "I ain't a man who knows what to do with a family, Josie. I live up here because I ain't fit for town living. Never was. Men like me, we don't build homes, we build shelters. I'm not asking for a town," she said, her voice dropping, fiercely steady. "I'm not asking for parlor talk or Sunday socials. We pull our weight." "You do," he agreed, his eyes locking onto hers, "more than most men would. But those tracks I found in the snow back in December, the ones who left you to the frost. The thaw means the road is open for them, too. It means they can come back up to check their work. Make sure the cold did the job they were too cowardly to do themselves." Josie's jaw set. The fear was a cold stone in her gut, a shadow in her eyes, but she didn't break his gaze. She had stared down death in a snowbank. She would not flinch at the mention of men. "Then we'll be ready for them." Hiram nodded slowly. "I'm going to walk the lower ridge, check the perimeter." He took his repeating rifle from the peg by the door. He didn't say goodbye. He just slipped into the trees, becoming a ghost among the pines. He patrolled the ridgeline for an hour. The snow was patchy, clinging stubbornly to the deep shadows of the ravines. He found the tracks near the lower crossing, where the creek flattened out over a bed of smooth river stones. 4 horses. Fresh, the mud was still settling around the edges of the hoofprints. They had come up yesterday afternoon, camped in the lower basin, and were moving up the switchbacks this morning. He knelt, pressing 2 fingers into the mud of a print. Water was just beginning to pool into the depression. They were close, maybe 2 hours behind him. He stood, his knees popping in the damp air. He didn't run. Panic wasted breath, and breath was life. He moved with a long, ground-eating stride, cutting straight up the slope, ignoring the switchbacks to shave time off his ascent. When he broke through the tree line at the edge of his property, he saw Josie by the chopping block, gathering kindling into her apron. "Get in the cabin," he said. He didn't yell, but the absolute flat certainty in his voice made her drop the wood instantly. "Who is it?" 4 riders. Coming up the main trail, she ran inside. He followed, grabbing the heavy wooden bar and dropping it into the thick iron brackets across the door. It fell with a heavy, final thud that vibrated through the floorboards. He moved to the window, sliding the heavy timber shutter half closed to create a narrow slit. He pulled the rifle up, checked the action, and laid out a handful of brass cartridges in a neat row on the rough-hewn table. Josie moved to the corner, placing Ben gently into the padded wooden crate. She didn't cry. The time for tears had frozen out of her months ago. She reached for the shotgun. She broke the action open, verified the 2 heavy shells sitting in the chambers, and snapped it shut with a sharp, metallic clack. "It's a man named Kincaid," she said, her voice tight but remarkably level. She stood behind Hiram, out of the line of fire, my husband's older brother. When my husband died of the fever in Denver, Kincaid wanted the silver claim. But the deed is in my name, legally passing to Ben when he comes of age. We were in the way of his fortune. He paid 3 men to escort us to the next town. Instead, they drove us up the pass and dumped us in the storm. Hiram didn't look back. He kept his eyes fixed on the tree line. He paying them to finish the job this time. He probably came himself, to find the bodies and take the paper. He's going to find a disappointment, Hiram said. The waiting was worse than the cold. It was a suffocating pressure in the small, dim room. Hiram stood by the slit in the window shutter, unmoving, a statue carved from old weathered wood. Josie sat on the edge of the bed, the heavy shotgun resting across her knees, her finger tracing the trigger guard. Outside, the creek roared. A solitary crow called out a harsh, echoing warning from the canopy. "Why didn't you ask me?" Josie asked, the question slipping into the quiet, a final piece of untied business before the violence arrived. All winter. "You never ask how I ended up in the snow." Hiram's eyes didn't leave the tree line. "Didn't matter. You were freezing. Only thing that mattered was getting warm. The past don't put meat on the table or wood in the stove. It matters now." "No," Hiram said, his voice dropping an octave, rumbling deep in his chest. "It don't. Kincaid, the silver deed, the Denver courts. None of it matters to me. Only thing that matters is that men are coming up my mountain with guns, looking to hurt what's in my cabin." He turned his head just a fraction to look at her over his shoulder. His eyes, usually guarded and flat as slate, held a dark, territorial fire. "What's in my cabin?" He didn't claim her as property, but he claimed the space, and he claimed the duty to protect the life inside it. Josie felt a strange, profound settling in her chest. The terror of Kincaid's approach was still very real, but it was anchored, outweighed by the immense, immovable presence of the man standing by the window. "They'll be armed heavy," she said. "They're city men," Hiram grunted, turning back to the window. "They know how to shoot in a dusty street or a crowded saloon. Up here, the light plays tricks on the eyes. The wind pushes lead. They're out of their depth, and they don't even know they're drowning. Yet, a twig snapped out in the yard. It was a sharp, distinct crack that cut cleanly through the background noise of the rushing water. Hiram raised the rifle. He settled the heavy stock into the pocket of his shoulder, marrying his cheek to the worn, oiled wood. From the deep shadows of the pines, a horse stepped into the muddy gleam. It was a big roan, its flanks heavily lathered with sweat from the brutal climb. A man sat in the saddle, wearing a heavy Apedius duster and a bowler hat that looked utterly absurd against the jagged, wild backdrop of the peaks. He held a repeating rifle casually across the pommel of his saddle. 3 more riders emerged behind him, fanning out slowly into the muddy yard, their eyes scanning the property. The leader Kincaid, Josie assumed by the arrogant cut of his coat and the nervous, twitching energy of his horse, spat a thick stream of dark tobacco juice into the snowmelt. He looked at the cabin, his eyes lingering on the closed door, noting the lack of smoke from the chimney. Hiram had let the fire die down hours ago to keep the smoke from giving away their exact position too early. "Looks empty," one of the hired men called out, his voice carrying clearly over the wind. "Check it anyway," Kincaid ordered, his voice nasal and impatient. "She didn't make it a mile in that storm, but I want to see the bones. Need the deed off her body if she kept it in her coat." Two men dismounted. They drew heavy revolvers from their leather holsters. The mud sucked loudly at their boots as they walked toward the porch. Hiram didn't breathe. He waited until the first man put a heavy leather boot on the bottom wooden step of the porch. He kicked the window shutter all the way open. The sudden, violent bang of wood hitting the Aristide log made the men freeze in the mud. Hiram didn't give them a warning. Warning men with drawn guns was a good way to catch lead in the teeth. He pulled the trigger. The rifle barked, a vicious, deafening crack that slapped against the surrounding granite peaks and echoed back down the valley. The man on the porch step folded instantly, taking the heavy slug dead center in his chest. He dropped without a single sound, pitching backward into the thick mud like a felled tree. Chaos erupted in the yard. The second man on the ground scrambled backward in a panic, firing his revolver blindly toward the open window. The window frame splintered violently. Sharp shards of pine sprayed across Hiram's face, drawing a thin, bright line of blood across his cheek, but he didn't flinch. He worked the lever action smoothly, aggressively ejecting the bent brass, and fired again. The second man took a hit to his shooting shoulder, spun like a top from the kinetic impact, and fell heavily behind the chopping block, screaming in agony. Out in the yard, Kincaid's roan reared up, terrified by the sudden violence. Kincaid fought the reins with one hand, struggling desperately to bring his own rifle up to bear. His remaining hired man, still mounted, spurred his horse toward the cover of the tree line, firing wildly over his shoulder. Inside, the cabin filled rapidly with the acrid, choking stench of black powder. Smoke hung thick and heavy in the stagnant air, stinging the eyes and catching in the throat. Hiram stepped back from the window as incoming lead chewed into the thick exterior logs. Dust drifted down from the ceiling rafters. "Stay low," he roared over the ringing din. Josie was already on the floor, crouched tight beside the crate, her body curved to shield the baby. Ben was crying now, a high, thin wail of pure terror caused by the deafening noise and the sudden tension. Hiram moved to the door. He didn't want to be trapped in a wooden box, pinned down by superior numbers. He threw the heavy bar up and kicked the door open with the heel of his boot. He stepped out onto the porch, moving through the lingering gray smoke of his own shots. He brought the rifle up just as Kincaid managed to steady his horse in the mud. Kincaid leveled his weapon at the massive man on the porch. Hiram fired first. Hiram's shot took Kincaid's horse in the heavy muscle of the neck. It was a brutal, ugly, but entirely necessary calculus of survival. The massive animal dropped like a stone, collapsing sideways and pinning Kincaid's right leg beneath 1,000 pounds of dead weight. The man screamed, a high, reedy sound, dropping his rifle in the mud as he clawed at the dirt. The last rider, seeing his employer trapped, his horse dead, and two men bleeding out in the dirt, didn't hesitate for a second. He whipped his panicked horse around and spurted hard down the steep mountain trail, abandoning the fight and his pay entirely. Silence crashed back over the clearing, ringing loudly in Hiram's ears, broken only by the sound of groaning men and the distant fading hoofbeats of the coward. The man behind the chopping block was weeping, holding his shattered shoulder to stem the arterial bleeding. Kincaid was thrashing wildly in the mud, trying in vain to pull his crushed leg free from under the dead roan. Hiram slowly lowered his rifle. He stepped off the porch. The mud squelched heavily under his boots. He walked over to the chopping block, his face an unreadable mask, and kicked the dropped revolver 10 feet away from the wounded man's hand. Then he turned and walked to Kincaid. Kincaid looked up, his face pale with shock, pain, and a sudden paralyzing terror. He saw the massive, bearded mountain man looming over him, a rifle held casually in one large hand, blood trickling slowly down his cheek into his beard. "Help me," Kincaid gasped, his bowler hat trampled in the mud beside him. "My leg is broke. I think it's shattered." Hiram looked down at him. His pale eyes were completely devoid of pity. "You left a woman and a baby to freeze in a December blizzard. I'll pay you. I got gold in my saddlebags. Just get the horse off me, please." Hiram didn't move a muscle. From the porch, a heavy floorboard creaked. Hiram didn't turn his head, but Kincaid's terrified eyes shifted upward. Josie stood on the threshold. She had stepped out of the cabin, leaving the crying baby safely in the crate. She held the heavy, double-barreled shotgun, the stock braced expertly against her hip. Her hair was loose, her face a mask of cold, hard stone. The helpless victim he had ordered left in the snow was gone. This woman standing on the porch had been forged by winter, by near death, and by sheer survival. She walked down the wooden steps, her bare feet uncaring of the cold mud. She stopped exactly 10 feet from where Kincaid lay trapped. "Josie," Kincaid pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. "Please, it was just business. The silver claim, you don't know how much debt I'm in." Josie raised the shotgun slowly, bringing the twin black muzzles level with Kincaid's chest. Hiram watched her. He didn't intervene. He didn't reach out to lower the barrel. He didn't tell her no. It was her ghost to put in the ground. Her finger hovered over the front trigger. Kincaid squeezed his eyes shut, turning his face away and weeping openly into the mud. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the high country was the rushing of the swollen creek and the wind moving through the ancient pines. Slowly, deliberately, Josie lowered the barrel. She didn't do it out of mercy and certainly not out of forgiveness. She did it with a deep, utter disgust that radiated from her posture. "You're not worth the brass," she said quietly, her voice carrying a finality colder than any winter storm. She looked at Hiram, her eyes meeting his. "Get him off the mountain." Hiram nodded once. He turned his attention back to Kincaid. "You hurt her." "I can't walk," Kincaid whimpered. "My leg is crushed." "Then crawl," Hiram said flatly. He reached down, grabbed Kincaid by the thick canvas collar of his expensive duster, and hauled him backward with brute strength. The mud surrendered its grip with a wet, tearing sound. Kincaid screamed in agony as his broken leg dragged freely from beneath the horse. Hiram dragged him 10 yards and dumped him unceremoniously next to the wounded man bleeding by the chopping block. "You got 1 good arm and 2 good legs between you," Hiram told the wounded man, staring him down, until the man nodded frantically. "Help him up. Walk down the trail. If I see either of you stop before you hit the valley floor, I'll put a rifle bullet in your backs from the ridge. If you ever come up this pass again, I won't leave you above ground." The wounded man scrambled awkwardly to his feet, driven by pure terror. He grabbed Kincaid by the coat, hauling his weeping boss upright. Kincaid screamed again, leaning heavily on the other man's good side. Together, they stumbled toward the trail, a pathetic, muddy, bleeding tangle of defeat. Hiram stood perfectly still and watched them go, his rifle resting at his side, until they disappeared completely around the first switchback of the trail. He turned back to the cabin. Josie was standing by the porch. The adrenaline was finally beginning to leave her system, and her hands were trembling slightly against the heavy wooden stock of the shotgun. Hiram walked up to her. He didn't speak. He reached out and took the weapon gently from her rigid grip. He broke the action open, catching the 2 unfired shells in his palm, and leaned the empty gun against the porch rail. He reached out with his other hand, rough and calloused, and traced the side of his thumb over her cheek, wiping away a dark smear of soot and powder. His touch was heavy, entirely unpracticed, but impossibly tender. "They won't come back," he said, his voice a low rumble. "No," she agreed, leaning into the warmth of his hand just a fraction, closing her eyes for a brief second. Inside the cabin, but the baby started crying again. A hungry, demanding, thoroughly alive sound. Hiram looked toward the open door, listening to the boy, then looked back at Josie. The winter was gone. The threat that had chased her up the mountain was broken. There was no excuse left for proximity. No storm keeping them trapped. Only choice. "Pass is open," Hiram said. The words felt like heavy stones in his mouth, difficult to push out. "You can take the deed, go down to Denver. Claim what's legally yours. Live comfortable." Josie looked up at him. She looked at the blood drying on his cheek, the black powder on his hands, the scarred, solid, unmovable reality of him. She thought of the parlor rooms in Denver, the stifling heat of society, the polite lies, and the men in bowler hats who dealt in betrayal. Then she looked at the cabin, rue, dark, smelling of wood smoke, sweat, survival. It was a shelter, but it was hers. "I claim what's mine," she said softly, her eyes locking onto his with absolute certainty. "I'm not leaving." Hiram stared at her. For a moment he didn't breathe. Then the rigid set of his broad shoulders, braced against a lifetime of crushing solitude, finally gave way. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound that seemed to carry 10 years of silence out into the thin mountain air. He didn't pull her into a desperate embrace. He didn't kiss her under the spring sun. He simply nodded, a slow, deep acknowledgement of a shifted universe. It was a promise forged in iron and snow. "Wood needs splitting," he said, turning his body slightly toward the yard, though his eyes lingered on her a second longer. Josie watched him for a moment. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth, softening the hard lines the winter had drawn there. "And the boy needs feeding," she replied. She turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving the heavy timber door wide open to let the fresh spring air in. The mountain was harsh, the work would be endless, and the winters would always be long. But for the first time in his life, Hiram heard the sound of the creek, the wind in the pines, and a woman singing a quiet lullaby inside his home. And he knew, with absolute certainty, he would never weather the cold alone again.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, Abandoned with a Baby in the Snow, she met a lonely mountain man who changed their destiny forever. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me was the sense of hope that can appear when someone feels completely alone. The story reminds us that compassion can matter most when another person is going through a difficult time, and sometimes simply choosing to care can open a door neither person expected. What would you have done if someone in need crossed your path? Do you think unexpected kindness can change the direction of a person's life? Maybe we can carry that lesson into our own lives by noticing when someone around us could use a little understanding. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these mountain man stories, feel free to like and subscribe.